So today we're going to, let me just talk a little bit about some of the session objectives. We're going to explore the vulnerability assessment worksheet, try and get an understanding of the California State Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We'll talk a little bit about the authorized equipment list that goes along with that grant program. You'll receive some information from an agency that's been through the process. And then at the end, we'll explore the opportunities if we choose to maybe do a second session and collaborate on some of the work that might need to be done to get through the vulnerability assessment worksheet. So we're going to start off with Len Connolly. He's the facilities director for Jewish Silicon Valley. He's going first primarily because he's a little short on time, and he is the person that went through the grant previously, and he's going to share a little bit of his experience. Now, I will tell you, when I asked Len to participate, I asked him if he would share information about his process, and he said, well, I can't do that because it's confidential. It's a security plan. And I thought, of course. So he won't be sharing anything specific about his plan, but he will give you some generalities. At this time, I'd just like to turn it over to Len, if you would go ahead and take yourself off of mute. And
good afternoon. Again, thank you for inviting me. Yes, it sounds a little bit like you're asking me to come and talk, but I can't give you any information, but I can give you some insight. First of all, I want to recognize a couple of people that are actually on this call. Scott Sano and Gina Doolin. I know you both. And you guys were major components in a couple of success stories that we had at our campus. And actually, you are probably the people I'm going to talk about the most. Vulnerability assessments. We have a guy who goes to work every day. He stands at the podium, lets people in, knows who the people are, knows everything about how the building runs, and knows how secure it is. This is the first person that people go to do an assessment. And I'm going to say that's very nice, but he's there every day. He doesn't have fresh eyes. And one of the best things you can do is talk to your local law enforcement or your life safety units. I had the ability to talk to Gina and her crew from NICRIC through our Los Gatos Montesino Police Department. And have them come out and do a vulnerability assessment. And I had been there for 15 years, and I had some things pointed out to me that I really didn't think about. Not only did I have things pointed out, but these are the experts that we count on every day to make sure that we're safe. And they know what's new, what's old, what can work, what can't work. And they give you the ability of aligning with what you have as a plan for the future. It might be piecemeal, it might be adding 5 cameras this year and maybe going for another grant in a few years to add more cameras. It's basically aligning yourself. And again, the fresh set of eyes. We've had 3 successful attempts at grants. We've actually applied over 7 times. You might not be successful, but we found with the ones that we were successful, involving NICRIC, involving your local law enforcement, they have a pulse on what's going on out there. They're able to give you the information, what events are happening around you, whether they be anti-terror or against anti-terrorism, whether it be assaults, what kind of crimes going on around you. They're the insight, definitely the insight to what's going on. And again, I would say who should do your vulnerability assessment? You can have numerous people do it. I would suggest you start with your law enforcement. If you have a security company that's working with you, you can ask them to do an assessment also and see what they come up with and see if they're aligning with what your mandate is. That's all it in a basic big ball. And again, making sure you take the recommendations and put them towards the grant. They can find flaws. They found lots of flaws in our building. So that's what I can share with you, Cindy. And our grant was successful 3 times. Are we 100% perfect? No, but we're still moving forward, and we are still going back to the same strategy that works, and that is definitely having the vulnerability assessment.
Len, you say you were successful 3 times. Can you tell us, did you get 3 grants? Did you get the grant 3 times?
We've received the grant 3 times. We started in 2007. Mm-hmm. It's now 2022, so yes. And depending on what we granted for, and it's not just the CalOES grant, but there are other grants that were together. I know the one with Scott was, I think, 2018 that we dealt with it, just before you moved over to your new position. And then we just received one this current year. And the first one was in 2008. So there was a big span. So it went from 2008 to 2018. So we're not always successful.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the time that you took with us. I know you're in the middle of a big project and you have to go. And
if you have any questions and want to get some answers that I can give you, send them to Cindy and I will gladly do it. And again, Gina and Scott, thank you again for all your help.
Thanks, Len.
This is Marcia. I have one question for Len. How long did it take to do the vulnerability assessment?
The vulnerability assessment, site visit, 1 day, writing it, many hours. And I don't know if Gina wants to comment on her late nights that she was working with our other staff people, but there's a lot of hours. It's not just a template that you just throw together, because every site, every situation is different. And you have some experts on this call.
Excellent.
Very good experts.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Len. Thanks for sharing. The next person up is Scott Sano. And Scott is with the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, and he works in the Infrastructure Protection Grants Unit, which are the ones that administer the grant that we're talking about. And I'm going to just let Scott tell you a little bit more about that. But before I do, let me just introduce the other 3 people that we have coming up after Scott. And that is Tom Ducker, who is a team leader for the Critical Infrastructure Protection Unit. And he'll give us some broad information about the assessment and about the grant as well. Gina Doolin is the intelligence analyst with the NICRIC, and she's got some information that she'll share as well. And then Ivan Williams is the grants program manager for Santa Clara County Office of Emergency Management. And Ivan's offered to stand by to give us a little information about the authorized equipment list. So with that, I will turn to the next slide, which is you, Scott. Give us a little bit about who you are and such first, if you would.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cindy. So as Cindy said, my name is Scott Sano. I am the supervisor of the Infrastructure Protection Grants Unit 2 at the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. So keep in mind, I said Infrastructure Protection Grants Unit 2. we actually have an Infrastructure Protection Grants Unit 1. That unit oversees the federal nonprofit security grant program. The unit that I supervise, we specifically supervise and administer the California State Nonprofit Security Grant Program. These programs are very similar. However, there is that major difference where the CSNSGP is state funded, and then obviously the federal NSGP comes from FEMA, from the federal government. So just to give you a little bit of background of the CSNSGP, the purpose of the CSNSGP is to provide funding support for target hardening and other physical security enhancements to eligible nonprofit organizations that are at a high risk for violent attacks and hate crimes due to their ideology, beliefs, or mission. So some examples of what the CSNSGP has funded in the past are right there in those 4 bullet points. So these are some examples, but they're not limited to. So, you know, there's other things other than, you know, fencing, lighting, cameras, security guards. You know, we do have some training activities. We do have some planning activities that people have done. But for the most part, it is equipment centric. And the way it works with the CSNSGP and, you know, the NSGP, they are both competitive programs. So not everybody is guaranteed to receive funding who applied for the grant, as Len mentioned earlier. I mean, I think he mentioned he applied 7 times and he received the grant 3 times. So it is very competitive. And the difference, you know, I'll say the CSNSGP, CalOES chooses who the awardees are. With the federal NSGP, the federal government chooses who receives the award. Now, for the upcoming CSNSGP grant, most likely it will be released by CalOES in late summer, sometime in fall of 2022. So that is, you know, coming up. It'll be real soon. We do not have a specific date yet, but if you are interested in receiving information such as the RFP, which, you know, the request for proposal, which is the document that gives all the guidelines, all of the requirements for this grant, right? This fiscal year 2022 CSNSGP grant. The best thing to do is email. I'm sure you can see that email address down there. It says csnsgp@caloes.ca.gov. If you just email that email address and just say, hey, put me on your list, we will respond. We will put you on our distribution list. And as soon as we release the FY 2022 CSNSGP RFP, you will receive an email from CalOES, and it'll contain the RFP, and it'll contain a schedule of application webinars and or workshops. You attend one of those, we will give you all of the details on, you know, who, what, where, when, how to apply for the grant. So, you know, I mean, apologies for being kind of short or, you know, kind of cryptic, but it is a competitive program. And, you know, from year to year, some allowabilities and unallowabilities, it may change. So what was allowable last year might not be allowable this year coming up, which is why the best thing to do is just get your name on our distribution list. And then as soon as we release the FY22 CSNSGP RFP, I mean, you will be emailed all of the details, and that the current RFP will release, it will include all of the relevant information that you will need to apply for the grant. So that's all I have, but once again, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Scott. Hey, I have a question. I have a couple of questions, actually. First off, the CSNSGP is in the fall. When does that grant actually, when does it get, what's the deadline for? I mean, you don't usually give the funds out until like next year, right?
I mean, it's all relative to when the RFP is released.
Okay.
Last year it was released in October.
Mm-hmm.
And then I mean, obviously, I mean, the grant, it all originates from the current state budget. And I forgot to mention one thing. It is not guaranteed that there will be a CSNSGP grant each year. We kind of have to wait to see, if it will be included in the current state budget. But based on years past, when people actually get funded, it's probably winter. I'll just say it'll be probably winter of whatever year we release the RFP.
That was kind of my real question, was versus the NSGP, which is more in the spring through summer, right? Isn't that kind of the difference of the two grants? Correct.
Well, because you have the CSNSGP, it's contingent upon the state budget, which is July 1. That's the beginning of the state budget. The federal budget, it begins in October 1. So that's why the two timelines are kind of different. You never know the conditions of the federal budget. So yeah, I mean, springtime is usually the time for the NSGP, and then fall or late summer is usually the time for CSNSGP.
And then my other question is, you said something about workshops. Are you going to be doing some kind of a workshop around this?
Correct. So when we release the RFP for the fiscal year 2022 CSNSGP, we will also release a schedule of webinars and/or workshops, which will give instructions on the application process.
Okay. And then just one other question. Last year, when you released the RFP, how long did they have to complete the RFP last year and get it turned in?
From the time that we released the RFP until the deadline, it's approximately 6 weeks.
Okay. So
5 to 6 weeks is what you could expect.
So it's a pretty short window. Okay.
Correct.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate you giving us that additional information.
Sure.
And this is Marcia. I have a question too. So the webinars that you'll be doing are talking about the filing process for the application versus questions about filling out the vulnerability assessment.
Correct. Well, the vulnerability assessment is a component of the requirements of the application. The webinars/workshops that we will hold, it will be to provide technical assistance on filling out the documents, I would say, if that answers your question.
On all the documents.
Correct. But like I said, I mean, the best thing to do is just get on our distribution list. When it's released, then all of the requirements and all of the guidelines that will be required for the application submittal process will be provided.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. That's great information. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Scott.
Sure.
Our next speaker is Tom Ducker. Tom, would you introduce yourself, and I'll stop sharing so that you can share your screen.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen in a second, but hopefully everybody can go and see my video right now, see me on the video before I put that up. And just really thank you for the opportunity, both you, Cindy, and Marcia, to come here and talk about these vulnerability assessments today. And this is really part of my job that I really find both important and fulfilling. And so having the opportunity really is gratifying me on a personal and professional level, because a lot of times what I end up doing is looking at big ticket items, things that are infrastructure, that are those dams, those road transportation systems, and also have to work with things like budget change proposals and how we go ahead and bring money and resources to things that are much more diverse, but also bigger than at the community level. So I just really appreciate the opportunity to come over and be able to do this. And from there, I'll go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll give you a presentation. And let me know if you can see that as it goes ahead, and should come forward, and you should see it full screen now.
Yes.
And what I'll go over today is I'll talk a little bit about some of the background on the vulnerability assessments and how those vulnerability assessments work in conjunction with some of the processes you might have with your organization already, and ways to kind of have a reference to what these things are and wrap your head around what a vulnerability assessment is. And then talk a little bit about the vulnerability assessment worksheet and what its purpose is. And to build on what Scott said, you know, there are two components that are in your application overall. There's a vulnerability assessment that's required, and then there's an investment justification, which is a formatted set of narrative blocks that go ahead and allow you to then show what you're going to do programmatically through it. And both of them together are part of that application process. And it's important to understand what the worksheet is doing as part of that vulnerability assessment. So it's a specific tool for the vulnerability assessment. And I'll go ahead and walk through that worksheet with you, and then give you a chance to give some questions and contact information. And, you know, I see that Scott, you're on there. If you want to go ahead and come in at any time, certainly feel welcome to you. But I'll give first a little background on who I am and where I come from, to give a little perspective on where this information is coming from. So my unit resides in the State Threat Assessment Center, which is a fusion center. And those fusion centers came out of the events in 9/11, and essentially the panel that looked at what are some of the failures on the information sharing side. And they said, we need to have a better way of having information that's given out across both government, public, private sectors, and created a network nationwide to be able to do that. And here in California, we have 6 of those centers, and the State Threat Assessment Center is the center that is at the state level and has an area responsibility for the entire state. And then you have a set of 5 regional and local fusion centers, of which the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center is one of them. And we have Gina Doolan on from that particular center. And when Len was talking about who we received assistance from locally, it was that fusion center that did it. And part of the job of my fusion center is to go ahead and assist those local and regional fusion centers and helping to provide information sharing and in their activities in here. And this part of today's webinar is really going to cover that vulnerability assessment part of the nonprofit security grant program. And just to let you know, is that what it not is to give you the authoritative view of the grant program. And Scott's on here to provide some of that information for you. But I'm covering it within context of the grant program. But you know, I'm not the authoritative source for exactly what the grant programs are and everything. And just to echo Scott, it's you know, looking at what are those requirements are for the grants when they come out, making sure you're familiar with those, and seeking the assistance when you have questions about those technical aspects to Scott and his team. Or on the federal side, we have Susan Holt and her team with that Infrastructure Protection Grants Unit 1. So, and getting that and everything. So once again, I just want to come back and say the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center is that local fusion center within the Bay Area that can provide information and help out making those connections that you need. And CalOES Infrastructure Protection Grants is the part of the organization that I work for, also CalOES, that provides that authoritative information on the grants themselves. Now, when we're talking about vulnerability assessments, first of all, it's what these things are and how they fit into your risk management processes. We all as organizations have some way that we look at risk, whether we know that or not. Sometimes it's as simple as looking at just the safety in the workplace for our employees or the people that we go ahead and work with. Sometimes it's in a larger full risk management project where we're looking at things like, a broad category of risks and look at how we prevent monetary loss. It's within a process that is going to be looking at how we transfer risk and how we reduce those monetary losses. Or it can be a combination of things that may be looking at things from the perspective of what are those things that may impact me from an emergency management perspective, going back to an emergency planning process. Or even if you're looking at it from a business perspective, you're looking at it as business continuity. And you may be doing things like business impact assessments that say, hey, if I have this function that's lost, I can't do what I'm supposed to do. Therefore, I have to figure out how to go ahead and reduce the chance that I'm not going to be able to go ahead and fulfill my function. So I just want to go ahead and bring that up because a lot of times people are doing things that are looking at risk that has a portion of it that's talking about vulnerabilities, and that a lot of people underestimate the amount of experience they have in dealing with risk. And we do this in every day that we're looking at, hey, what's the traffic situation going to be going into work, okay? What are the possibilities for things going wrong for me? How do I go ahead and reduce that? Maybe I take a different route to that, or I take a different means of transportation. So we all have some experience in doing some sort of risk assessment, and maybe organizationally or down to the personal level. And when it comes to the program that we're looking on, these nonprofit security grants, they originally, the original one was from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is within Department of Homeland Security. And it looked at a risk in kind of a way that's defined by Department of Homeland Security, which is, threat is a function, or risk is a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So those three components have to be in there. How they actually relate to each other and their weighting is something that is variable and a challenge sometimes to go ahead and corral. But if you're going to look at risk, you need to look at those three things. So when you're looking at the nonprofit security grant and what they're asking you to do, it's the reason why you see those things that are within the investment justification over even in that vulnerability worksheet that we'll get to. How do you define your threat to you? How you define those consequences, the impact if that threat actually occurs to you. And vulnerability is the way in which that threat will go ahead and interact your organization to cause those consequences, okay? So it's a way of, in this case, with the nonprofit security grants, is to say your full investment justification. And by the way, the thing that's going to be scored is going to say, hey, here are all of these particular elements. But what we want is a good vulnerability assessment to go ahead and really be able to hone in on what areas are that we could have some gaps that we can then cover through some of the grant money that you'd be able to go get. It's a resource provided to you to go ahead and fix some of those things that you perceive as being issues and gaps. And so originally the nonprofit security grant program is asking specifically for a risk of terrorism. What you can see from Scott's talk was also that particularly within the California portion, the language has been broadened a little bit to include overall violent acts and hate crimes. And part of that is because if you start getting into all of the myriad ways in which terrorism is defined, a lot of them talk about that there's a part of that motivation is to change behavior in terrorism through that fear. And the thing is that sometimes with hate crimes, it is people that are haters, and they may not go ahead and have that bent behind them that they're really trying to change behavior. They're just acting out through their perspective, the way to do it in that act of hate against someone. So just because of these technical definitions, there have been broadened, and that means that for the look at threat, you can go ahead and use a wider set of threats to be able to inform where your risk lies in it. And just understand then that investment justification portion of it, it's asked you to go ahead and define what your threats are, your vulnerabilities, your consequences. So that's there within that scored section, investment justification. And keep in mind that the vulnerability assessment is a means to an end. It's a means to go ahead and collect the information you need to go ahead and make sure that investment justification is filled out. And we get things a little bit muddled because we call it a vulnerability assessment. So in the original design, it was really looking at how do we go ahead and get to those vulnerability elements and be able to understand them. But particularly when you see the worksheet, because it's a way to show your work behind your investment justification, some of those elements of threat and consequences have been put on that worksheet to help in the collection of the data that you need to be able to go and do a good job looking at risk overall. So I'll go on to the next slide. Of course, if there's any questions, I'm ready to take them at any time on it for here. So when we're talking about vulnerability assessments, just understand it is only one part of a complete risk assessment. And I don't want you to go ahead and sell yourself short of your organization if you've done something that's looked at risk overall. Sometimes even going to some, for instance, some local faith-based organization, we've seen that their insurance has required them to go out and take a look and see what they've done to keep their employees safe and to be able to go ahead and do emergency planning and so forth. And just in that base, they've got a lot of information about what security is like to something to start out and to be able to plan and understand what they need to be able to do to go and get a good vulnerability assessment. And for a vulnerability assessment, as you're going down the road to get that done, you have to ask yourself what you're going to look at, okay? Are you going to look at in a wider sense, vulnerability specific to an act of terrorism or hate crimes or the violent crime, and use that as the basis for what you're looking at? Or are you going to look at it from a different perspective, which is from the bottom up and looking at what the grant authorizes, like Scott was talking about? It has a certain equipment that you're allowed to go ahead and purchase to improve your physical security. It has some aspects of it that can allow you to spend resources down on planning, training, exercises. And sometimes, and most recently was added to it, allowing a certain percentage that could go to guards to address a vulnerability, okay? And I just have to say, before we go any further, that as you're looking at what you want to do with a vulnerability assessment, always look at a notice of funding opportunity, either the most recent one, or if you have one available to you to go and shape your vulnerability system, you want to look and see if there's changes in what your the focus is for that particular for the program. There's changes in what you can and cannot buy on it, but you also want to go and understand that your vulnerability assessment, when you do it, is good for a number of years. Okay, and you have to look at. Sometimes there can be some supplemental guidance that says, hey, you know, if it's older than this, we may want you to go and do one. But a vulnerability assessment, a good one, is going to give you the state of your physical security at that location and take a little bit about your training and exercises and the planning that you're doing and a little bit of that guard force. And it's not necessary for you, nor is it really intended by the Nonprofit Security Grant Program for you to fix everything at once. And that comes back to what Len said. This is one thing that can be a multi-year set of enhancements, improvements, and looking at your physical security. And you can go ahead and do a good vulnerability assessment and then use that for a number of years. And every year you come back and validate, has there something changed? What have I improved? What have I didn't? But you don't have to go and do the whole process again. And just in a strict technical sense, you're going to be putting a vulnerability assessment into for the nonprofit security grant application. And if you have one and it's not, there's nothing that goes ahead and says it's expired out through the requirements of that notice of funding opportunity, you can use it again. You can refresh it to whatever degree, but the majority of it could certainly be the same. And as Scott pointed out, there's two flavors. And so you have one that's generally spring and one in fall. And honestly, the reason why the federal one tends to be in the spring is you go and say, hey, the budget should be approved and it starts the federal government in October, but it just hasn't happened in recent years. And essentially, once the president signs the bill, there's a certain number of days after that they have to go ahead and release the information on grants that have been authorized in that particular fiscal year of federal funding. To be honest, I didn't go and look exactly what it is. I believe it's 60 days, but don't quote me on that afterwards. It could be 90 on it, but that starts the clock ticking. So once you see that the budget's been signed by the president, Congress has gone through all of its stuff, they've come to the reconciliation and everything, and he signs it. This clock's ticking to get that federal one out. And it's just been that it's been delayed enough that it's been offset in spring. And then the reason why it's fall or into the later part of the year for California is with our July budget, we find out whether we have the money and then have to go through the process of making sure that everything that we're doing with that program is good, it aligns, and everybody's good with how we're going to spend that money and then get it out to folks. But ultimately, they're a very similar process. The vulnerability assessment process is virtually the same, but there can always be a few minor things that you need to be aware of. And I'll go back to just what is at the top of the slide is that always look for something that says a supplemental guidance or what has changed. And those summaries will go ahead and help you get an idea of what you should key on and be able to look at for it. So are there any questions for me? Let me see if I can take a look. Okay, I see I do have one that says, is being unsheltered considered a credible threat hazard for a grant application? Inclement weather and exposure to extreme hazards are life-threatening. So the nonprofit security grant one is a focus on security. There's other grants that will come along that can address those particular things. But this is a focus on, as you saw, on what Scott said, with violent crimes, hate crimes, terrorism on it. So generally, they would not be covered under this for the application. Now, if you're, I'm not. Unfortunately, getting into how to fill out your investor, I can't go ahead and talk about, because my team often provides someone to help with the assessment or evaluation of the justifications. But I would just say that particularly organizations that have a focus on doing a disaster response or assisting in that, there are some areas in there to explain how you're important to the community, and there's an opportunity to put that information in that investment justification. So I'm sure you'll get more of that if you go to one of the workshops, and I highly recommend that to get the straight information from CalOES when those workshops come and talk through some of those things, where you can put these things in a technical manner.
If I may, Kathleen from the Office of Supportive Housing, thank you for this presentation, and Kadri, you're awesome. So this is really much more infrastructure focused than say social supports, and we should look for supporting, for instance, needing generators so that we can continue services when they're inclement weather. Okay, thanks so much.
You'll see that, in fact, that was a program that went on for 2 years through CalOES that allowed organizations, including nonprofits, to get those backup generations. So that was a different grant program done through a different part of CalOES.
Do you happen to remember if that's still in active, or the name?
I think it's already past the period on. I think we did both of the ones that went to nonprofits and then went to government organizations too.
Okay.
It occurred, I think, 2 years ago, if I remember, 2 years, and then maybe towards the end of last year. But I could go back and get that information.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
I scored a bunch of them, so.
We'll watch for upcoming potential opportunities for other grants as well, and share that with you.
But I'll tell you, Kathleen, and as I'm looking through the questions, I think it would still be good to answer some of the questions in the vulnerability assessment for what you do, because there are threats to your personnel, and there could be ways to make even camps safer. And even if this isn't the grant, I think you're on mute again. I just think some of the thinking through that process from a security standpoint and a safety standpoint, it might just help you as you're writing another grant for something else.
I completely agree. Yep. So I'll be doing that with our providers, vulnerability assessment. Thank you.
And that kind of leads to a question that I have, Tom, which I think ties into that a little bit. And that is, would you think it to be valuable to do a vulnerability assessment, even if you weren't applying for grant funding?
Well, I think this goes back to what I was talking about, what your management processes and how you do risk assessments overall for your organization. Certainly taking a look at what are those ways in which bad things can go ahead and get to actually be active on your facility or your area or your folks is kind of the part of the part of the risk that the vulnerability system is looking at. So looking at the fact is, if there are floods, okay, are you on a piece of low ground that's going to come from this area and so forth? That's part of the vulnerability assessment, part of looking at floods or wildfire. You're looking at some of the things that are there about the fuel loading and stuff in the area. So yes, it is that. And the broader sense of it is that, you know, if you're doing an impact analysis on your functions that you're doing, whether it's providing services to those people that are unhoused, or you're looking at different ways in which you're going to provide other social services. And part of it is to look at, hey, how can they be disrupted? And then, you know, the ways in which they can be disruptive or whatever that threat is. So it's a good idea to be able to look at it, but with whatever lens you're using within your organization. So using what you have and developing that out and looking at it through all of the different threats and hazards you think that are applicable to you is really where I think the most value is for an organization.
Thank you.
So I'll go in and I'll just talk about the vulnerability assessment worksheet, and I'll bring it up and go through it in just a second. But I just wanted to let you know that it's there to be used as a tool to be able to support the completion of the application. So, it was originally brought in to give a formatted way to have organizations that may not have another method that they use for their risk overall and look at vulnerability, to have a shorthand or a way to go ahead and go through the basic elements of looking at a facility that would cover the areas that the nonprofit security grant is looking to apply resources towards. And so it's really an abstract from a whole bunch of different things to kind of shape it down. Going back to what I said before, is looking at those areas that might be affected by terrorism originally, or violent crimes, hate crimes, and then scaling it down a little bit more to go and look at those specific things that you could potentially fix some gaps that you might have in your capabilities, and putting those on the list. So we'll come down there and we'll talk about, access control and cameras and stuff like that on there and everything. But the worksheet itself is really just a shorthand or almost like a checklist to be able to go through those areas that you would need to look at to be able to perform a vulnerability assessment that would get you the information that you need to properly understand what you can go ahead and correct or fix or improve through the grant program, okay? So what it's not is not a comprehensive security checklist out there. It's not going through every factor that you would look at in security on it. And so it's one of those is that it's useful within the context of the vulnerability assessment and with the nonprofit security grant. And in fact, it has some wider applications. We've had, schools, and we've had some other organizations that are some smaller infrastructures that would say, hey, this is about the size that we can bite off and understand and be able to do things. So rather than go ahead and say a contract or to go ahead and go through a much larger process for the vulnerability assessment, let's look at these things first. And particularly if you're starting out, you're trying to see what is that bite of the proverbial elephant that you're going to take to tackle that particular issue. It's a way to go ahead and look at it that's been cut down to size and shaped to be able to do in a relatively quick and organized fashion. And that's where we get back with Len say, is a day of collection on site is normally sufficient for it. Yes, there's a lot more involved in what you use that information for to overall look at risk and how you're going to go ahead and buy down that risk through this program, but it's designed to go ahead and be a quick down and fairly easy and straightforward process to go ahead and do. And just understand that it may be a required format, particularly check with CalOES supplemental guidance. In addition to being very useful for individuals that want to go out and take a look at how to go ahead and do their vulnerability assessment, it also allows on the back end when your application is put in, is to have a format that is standardized across each one of the applications. So it's easier to go and cross-reference when you're looking at it as someone that's evaluating the application package. So it's one of those things that CalOES can and may have as a required format. So always check with that. But more broadly speaking, and I have to bring it up, is to go back to where it says it's a tool to support the completion of an application. And that means you can have a vulnerability assessment or something that matches the needs of the vulnerability assessments you've done to a different process, and you've done a vulnerability assessment that's done a completely different process. You've brought in a protective security advisor from DHS that's used a self-guided assessment. for instance, going on through there. You've gone to the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center and they've assessed according to the way that they look at it. You've had a law enforcement officer who's come in and done something that is largely through the lens of crime prevention through environmental design, for instance, a SEPTAT program. All those things provide the data that you need to be able to go ahead and do a proper vulnerability assessment and then be able to transfer it to that worksheet. But I don't want you to think that the worksheet is the vulnerability assessment. The vulnerability assessment, both at the top level, is something that fits in that overall risk assessment and other elements. And the methods that you use for vulnerability assessment can be varied and can be brought in based on the experience and perspective of the individuals that are coming to do that. And we've seen, various people be highly successful on doing this. And though, Scott and his team at CalOES go through and look at, who they would go ahead and either recommend or say should be the folks that fill these out. So once again, you have to look at the requirements, and they may say for this year, we're going to look at folks with a law enforcement or they have a military background, and they'll go ahead and express that. We see more broadly folks being able to come for, I'll use this again, they're insurance inspectors. They come in and take a look and see what you're doing in insurance on there. They come from a strictly a risk management and reducing that risk from business. They come in and can do a great job being able to go ahead and do the detailed look that allows you to be able to use this worksheet or fill in this worksheet from other processes and get it down. So as I come in here is just ultimately understand that document, the worksheet, it's showing your work behind selected security improvements. It's showing that work that then allows you to be able to go and do that investment justification. And this is some language from the federal side of it. And here it says, in order, the security improvements that address an identified risk, including threat and vulnerability, and build or sustain a core capability in identifying the goal. It's fancy language that says it gives you the information to identify that risk and then build some sort of capability. And when you talk about the goal, don't get scared about that. On the federal side, they have to break everything down into capabilities that you're trying to go ahead and do to be able to be successful in security. So there's a number of those that are identified under the federal set of goals for security and actually for response recovery frameworks. Okay, and ultimately that work is showing that your selected security improvements are feasible and effective at reducing the risk for which the project was designed. Okay, so it's almost like in math, you're going to go ahead and have your sheet that you're going to go and turn in that's your answers. And on the other hand, though, is that you have a worksheet which you've done all of the math behind it. Okay, and you're putting both of them in to go ahead and get to be available in the process of looking at really the grade, but the actual score is coming strictly from your investigation justification part of it. And you can ultimately use whatever method that works or is in use by your organization to collect and assess the information that you have for vulnerability assessment. And that comes back to just on who has been successful on doing these is look, I don't want you to sell short that you have members of your organization that can go ahead and do this. And if they have a background in doing organized, inspection, primarily, if they come from law enforcement or military, and like I said, you have to check the notice of funding opportunity sometimes to see if there's specifically, thou shalt use these people backgrounds. But it's been highly successful for either an individual or a team to come together that have the perspectives from across different jobs and professions that look at an organized way to collect information to be able to determine some sort of risk. And so don't avoid looking at your individuals that you have within your organization, seeing what they have available. And folks have been highly successful in doing that. And really, then these are not in an order of a priority or anything, but local law enforcement, since they are the ones that are going to respond to an incident, having them involved and getting their perspective of how security works at your organization is a key. So if you're able to go ahead and do that, it's important. And the Regional Fusion Center can give you some of that, high level look at risk and be able to bring in a different perspective and format. I used to always say when we talk about regional fusion centers and you're talking a lot of times about a group of 2, maximum of 3 people. And Gina can address that. So a lot of times they can get a couple of these done, but in a large measure, they have to be coordinated in nature and find or help you getting resources to be able to do. And that goes back to something that I haven't emphasized enough. You don't have to wait for a notice of funding opportunity to drop to go ahead and get a vulnerability assessment. You can do it before and really get most of it done, modeling it on previous notice of funding opportunities. And then when you look, when the notice of funding opportunity drops for that upcoming period, you check to make sure if there's any changes and specific things that you need to go ahead and change or look at and update that. And then you're not looking at having to go and scramble and get a assessment done in a 5 to 6 week period, and then having to go ahead and take the results of that assessment, doing all of the stuff that you need to do to get your actual application successful. So it's always good. They can be done any time of the year and really look at it. And that brings into like the other portion of it. And I put that on there because we've all seen this where people have gone and used associations, just like we have here with Cadre, but also could be a faith-based set of organizations, professional organizations across which your nonprofits are working in. They've worked successfully with bringing in folks that are part of even some retired associations and so forth to be able to do that, or overall within some faith-based organizations, if they're part of a larger structure, even nationally, to go back to them and say, hey, what have you done successfully nationally and everything. Get some background on. So they're all those things are available to you to look at and take a look at before you do that. Now, just to let you know, I'll bring up we're finally getting to the worksheet itself, and I appreciate your patience and letting me go through and talk about these from kind of that theoretical perspective and everything. And just to understand that there's sections 1 to 3 of this workshop, which really are talking about information that's in common over to the investment justification, how you name and characterize your particular organization in it. And it's always good to really look at on that notice of funding opportunity and supplemental, if there's changes to that and the way that they want a naming nomenclature and everything and so forth. But they're broadly the same between both of them. And that really the annex or the second part of it is really that on-site vulnerability assessment template. And let's see if I can go and stop sharing for a second and then bring up that. So.
While you're doing that, let me just ask Scott a question. Scott, is there a place on your website where people can see previous grants and kind of get an idea of what a previous grant looks like?
Yes. I'm trying to figure out a way to. Can
you put it
in the link? There's no way that I could. Okay, there's no way that I could.
Can you type it?
Like the exact pathway? Excuse me.
Can you type it in the chat?
I can try, but I mean, I'd have to copy the link. Basically, if you go to our website, how about this? I think this is the easiest way. If you go to our website and you type in infrastructure protection grants, all of not all, but there are a lot of previous documents there are a lot of documents from previous CSNSGP grants and NSGP grants. So you'll go to the page and there will be a page that says infrastructure protection grants. And then there will be a list of CSNSGP documents and NSGP documents. I will try to find a way to
I think Ivan actually just did it. I think it's in the link already. I think Ivan put it in for us.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Ivan. There is one thing that I just wanted to kind of clarify, going back to Tom's previous the slides that he was on, where he mentions the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and state supplemental guidance. Whenever you hear that, okay, whenever you hear NOFO or state supplemental, that is in reference to the federal NSGP. If you ever hear RFP, request for proposal, you'll hear that a lot. That is associated with the California State Profit Security Grant Program. So they're equal in terms of that's the document that you go to see what the current guidelines are, regarding the vulnerability assessment or the grant application requirements. So, we use a lot of government, jargon, and we kind of use it every day, but it might be confusing, where you hear somebody say, oh yeah, the state supplement, or I'll say, hey, the RFP, go check out the RFP. If you hear the words RFP for CalOES, that is the state, CSNSGP. When you hear NOFO or state supplemental, that is regarding the federal NSGP. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, because I know I mentioned the RFP, as this document that will provide all of this information. And then, Tom went over the NOFO and state supplemental. So I know it could get kind of confusing, but I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
Sounds good. And yeah, you got to understand that my background going on this was well prior to the California NSPG or GP. So it ends up sometimes that I'm speaking more federal than I should be as a Californian. So I apologize for that. Let me see if I can go and get this on the screen. So let me know if you see what appears to be on there. I'll see if I can go ahead and get it a little bit larger right now. How readable is that for everybody out there?
I can see it clearly. Okay.
So, on this, I'll just go through this and then I'll come back to some slides and give you an idea of some of the thoughts on how to go ahead and fill this out successfully on it. As I said, the first sections are giving you, general information that is crosses over to the investment justification. And sometimes it's asking you to do some additional things in here that might help you out by having a photo of the nonprofit site and giving some information about who your local law enforcement and fire are that you'd want to go ahead and know overall for your risk assessment, and just your background information that's talking about your membership sites. And because some of the things in the investment justification allows you to say what are the impacts that could occur if your facility was damaged, attacked, was shut down in some way. So it does go ahead and talk about some of those things that you're supporting. Like if you've got schools, library, event centers, and some other things in there. So that gives you an opportunity to collect that information as part of it, as well as taking a look at your overall threats and being able to go ahead and say, if I've had incidents and they've occurred over the last 5 years or anything, describe that impact to your nonprofit site to get the juices flowing. And as you go ahead and do your narrative and the investment justification, you have these on hand. And if you're going to law enforcement, or you're having a contractor that's looking at crime statistics and so forth and so on, they may be able to provide some additional information. But once again, don't shell short your organization that you've collected information about things that have happened to your own site on here. Is that our own ways of being able to collect things that have happened, whether that is vandalism that may have gone ahead and been part of an adjunct of what may be a hate crime, or you've seen some sort of criminal activity, or there's been folks that have gone ahead and gotten past your perimeter to the main part of your campus. If you have multiple buildings and so forth and so on, all of them are there to go ahead and do. And then when you come down to the next part of it, is you have then what is the vulnerability assessment proper, and it goes through a number of different areas. And I'm not going to go through it in detail to go ahead and do every part of it, but I just want you to know that's laid out really so that you're looking from the outside and then coming inside and then looking at maybe some of your organization's ways that you go ahead and operate and have security procedures in place. So it's really starts with that perimeter and then access control. And access control is a fancy way of saying how you let people in. And it's here with the perimeter because you're talking right at the edge of whatever your property is, and how you control that. And then also it'll ask you questions about internal to that sometimes. So keep that kind of as a mental note, is that's the way it's kind of designed to go and take a look at outside in. And part of that is because for the most part, and I say this, you can always have someone that could be inside an organization that could be, perpetrate something bad. We talk about this, and in workplace violence and so forth. But a lot of times we have people that are outside your organization wanting you harm. They're seeing you from the outside and in. So this is a way to kind of orientate yourself to what somebody's seeing and being able to then go back and kind of peel back the onion or the different layers of potential security that you have from that perspective. So it starts out like that. And then it takes a look at lighting and then intrusion detection systems. And once again, lighting can be from the perimeter on in and talk about the various different ways of lighting and the way that you then look at intrusion detection systems, which are a fancy way to say your alarm system and the way that you go ahead and be able to understand what's happening on your facility. And look, generally within physical security, when you're looking at all of these, you're looking at one, how you can detect that something is happening that is detrimental to your organization, okay, on it. And then the next step is how you go ahead and start that response to it. Generally on the physical side is how you're going to delay that particular malicious act to the point where then it can be neutralized, or that you get past that period in which someone is actively trying to go ahead and do that. And part of that is the communications of the fact that that's a threat. So when you're talking about an intrusion detection system, it's how it works together to say, hey, something bad's happening, how it communicates that fact to somebody and helps to go ahead and delay the actual bad actor from doing whatever they're going to go ahead and do until you can properly respond. And I'm just going to go ahead and just say that in general, because when it comes down to it, whether that response is having, the law enforcement, the police show up, or it's that you as a group within your group have a way that you look at how to go and deal with it. For instance, with Department of Homeland Security, they're always talking about run, hide, fight, what actions you're going to go ahead and take. Your system is designed to go ahead and help you go ahead and exercise those options. So, and so when you get done looking at those issues of, perimeter, how people get on, how your lighting is, you're looking at things like cameras and those detection systems that are on there. Then it's a little about your security operations, if you have them, if you've got who's out there looking around and determine whether things are safe and whether you're using actual guards or security country, or whether you have volunteers and members that are out there looking to security. So, and then it ends up with what's called fancily mitigation options. What can you do to go ahead and make things better, okay, in these different areas from any of the gaps that you might see? So that if I don't have cameras here, but I do have a gate and I want to go ahead and better detect things here, that's where someone puts the part of the vulnerability assessment and which we put in the worksheet to options. I'll say that sometimes when you have folks that are coming from the government side, they'll do these mitigation options, but almost never will they come out and prioritize for it, because they're not going to act on your behalf to tell you what your risk is for your organization and tell you then effectively what you should go ahead and do first, second, or third. The responsibility is on the organization that is doing it to kind of determine within that risk management process I talked about where their priorities lie, and take some of these options that are given and determine which ones actually we're going to go ahead and cover or attempt to go ahead and resolve through this nonprofit security grant program. Okay, so that's physically the way it's laid out. I'll go back to my slides and talk a little bit more about filling this out and doing a vulnerability assessment. But once again, if there's any questions, let me know. And that should stop the sharing and let me come back to the slide presentation here. Hold on, bring this up. And give me one more second. And you should see it now in full screen.
Yes.
And the main thing that I want to go ahead and and say that as you go through all of these and you look at perimeter, you look at how folks are getting into that. And as you get into from the perimeter is how people would be able to get into individual buildings or sections of the campus where you're going to have people that you want to go ahead and protect. It comes down to that is looking at, what are your activities there, where people are, how you want to go ahead and protect them, and look at ways that you can, as I said before, discover that something bad's happening, be able to make sure people understand that it's going on, delay any of that, those malicious or bad actors from doing things. And so what I just want to point out though on this, a lot of times it's really about in this worksheet and getting the data for that vulnerable system is to keep it simple. The worksheet's designed for you to go ahead and do a lot of yes, no. Do you have cameras? Do you not? Okay, kind of things on there. Do you have intrusion assistance? And then asking you, could you describe X or describe Y? So it's keeping it simple, answering the questions. It's based on observations. So it's designed for you to go out and actually look at the facility itself and collect the data as you walk around and try and understand how everything works within its physical space and the way people are using that particular space and the way that security may be there, whether you have gates already there along with a fence line or you do not, so forth. Taking those things, taking the observation the way it is and putting that down into the spreadsheet. Doing those descriptions is appropriate when they're asked is, hey, if they're saying describe the camera system, put in some of the details that you can see there and the areas of coverage and so forth. But do that. And the last thing is make an effort to go through every section. And if it doesn't apply, making sure that it says, hey, it does not apply. If you do not have a contracted guard force or you don't have volunteers that are out doing anything in the security side of it, it's simply saying, hey, that we don't have any of these things. And none of them are. But that then is a cue to go ahead and look at it and say, is this something that would go ahead and better security here within the way that we operate, okay, on having it. So when using this worksheet and part of a vulnerability assessment, it is being, as simple in the way that you go into and put things together as possible, answering those yes and no's, making sure it's based on observations that you go out and actually take that for the individual that's filling out the worksheet. You do those descriptions when they're asked for and address every section. So, and this is just because I have a Pirates of the Caribbean fan that works for me who always is using this line. So I'd throw it in as, keep to the code. In this case, it's the vulnerability assessment code on it. So a little bit, on the silly side, but at the same time, use that idea of simple, direct observations, descriptions, and make sure you address the sections, okay? And then when you have that workshop, that's where you can go ahead and take those observations and what you have there and match them up to threats that you've identified. If you've had some of that criminal activity that is there, okay, that has said, okay, these people were able to go ahead and get onto your campus this wise. This is what we say is there for the way that we've got our fences and the way that we're able to go ahead and observe through cameras and everything, and how we go ahead and improve it to make sure that we don't have that particular threat happen again, for instance, on that. Now, or more broadly, if you don't have specific incidents that you're going there, more broadly on how you go and better understand what's happening on your campus and being able to go ahead and getting some of those mitigations and match up with the consequences. You're looking at the way that your organization is structured and saying, this is where people are, this is where they congregate. That's a priority. We need to go ahead and look at it and be able to provide additional security measures for those. And then it's about also, you may have other things that are there that you want to go ahead and look at. You said some of you may have cultural properties or so forth that you're looking at on it. And it's looking at the fact that some of this is varies according to time, is that you may have either a regular work hours in which you have people live there that need to have a certain level of security on there, or you have events that are there that you need to go ahead and do a certain security that may be ramped up at those times, and multiple different kinds of events and how those all tie together, and which ones that within your risk process you're prioritizing to be able to go ahead and look at what those and enhancements that you want to ask through the nonprofit security grant. So, and it ties into finally what you're looking at is looking at then as your overall reduction of risk based on those priorities you set. You've got different observations that say, I don't have cameras here, okay, but I want to go ahead and have a better look at what is, occurring near where we have people that we want to go ahead and protect. And can that be accomplished by nonprofit security grant funds? And does it fit with our organizational strategy and capabilities? And I'll talk a little bit about this more in depth and go back to the other slide on it. Because you see these perimeter access control, intrusion detection, camera systems, and security operations kind of there. And it's difficult to go ahead and say without actually really getting together as an organization and determining what are all those important things to you as to what are the items that you want to go ahead and improve upon. So it really does take a whole approach from an organization to be able to understand what is those important things that need to be protected and be able to look at where they have them, and to understand that no single aspect of a security system that you would build based on your observations is going to address everything to it. And even as you do this, a lot of this is common sense, okay, in the sense that, if you look at it and you have a fence, fences are something that people can go over, okay? So if you have a fence there, what's the next thing that you'd want to go ahead and do on there? You'd want to go ahead and see that happen. Well, how do you go ahead and see that happen? Do you have someone that's out there that's observing the area? Or if you don't, what do you do in the absence of that, of having, say, cameras? What are cameras good for? Well, are cameras something that you're going to monitor and have available then when you're having people on campus where someone is actively being able to see where that threat is? Or are they something that you're using to be able to look at things when people aren't there, be able to inform you what's happening after hours, and can be used as an adjunct to investigations or to be able to further understand what your risk is, but they're not being monitored. And so they're not necessarily going to go ahead and allow you to be able to get immediate communication and figure out what's going on and bringing somebody out to do something at those points. So all of these are things that come together that when you're looking at them kind of roll together through common sense. And I say that, and I know people are probably saying, hey, look, how do I go ahead and understand more fully what are those common sense elements? Well, the elements are here about perimeter and access control, intrusion control, cameras and everything. And for the nonprofit security grant program, specifically, keeping it simple and being able to go ahead and come back to that code, making sure that you're looking at things that are achievable and doing within the grant program are something that is very important to be able to do. And as I go through this, and I'll go on to the next one, and you start looking at how you overall reduce your risk, it's being able to go ahead and then marry this to your strategy and say, hey, we do want to go ahead and have some additional security elements that are in there that are based on making sure that our perimeter is a little bit more secure. And we want to go ahead and make sure there's some fencing here and we have some gates we can go ahead and put down, or we're going to do cameras, or we're going to do some interior barriers that are going to allow us to go ahead and channel some traffic this way and so forth on it. But ultimately, it's looking at that and also looking at what you can achieve with if it's the federal or state. And we're talking maybe $150,000 to $200,000 out of that chunk, or maybe less, and then understanding what you'd go ahead and ask for under the targeting hardening part of your purchases in the investment justification, and just understand that I'm a little bit stronger in the language than maybe I should use it, but I mean that the VA worksheet information I say must align with the selected targeted hardening purchases. That's the best practice. Is that you're gonna say what you want under target hardening practices in the IJ. Your VA ultimately, as your worksheet, should say that you've taken some observations and put them down that say that you do or do not have these things. Okay. And that part of it is coming back to then looking through your risk project to see what are those options to improve in those areas are, get them into that target hardening place. And, it's one of those things where I've seen over the years that it's been tightened up under these programs, asking for, a better alignment between VA worksheets and the targeting hardening, purchases on it. And the only thing is that, in general, and Scott can go ahead and come over or anything like that, the federal government is fairly, hey, whatever vulnerability assessment you have is good, okay? And that whoever is doing it is going to go ahead and be good for us or anything like that. But in some ways, that when it comes down to California, we want to go and see your work a little bit more. And one of the things the worksheet does is to be able to make it so it's easier to show good work that goes ahead and shows that alignment to the target hardening purchases, and that you're able to go ahead and then have a very strong application on it. So with that, I see we're moving along here towards the end. So I'm just going to open it up for general questions on, hold on, yeah, actually, yeah, before I go back to questions, well, no, I'll do that in a second. I'll open up to questions you have about the process or things that I've discussed so far.
Can I just add, I'll just add one thing real quick. So going back to what Tom mentioned about us, like CalOES, and you know what FEMA will do when we look at these applications, how we look for consistency on your vulnerability assessment compared to what you are requesting via your grant purchases. It is very important. So if you are asking for $100,000 worth of lighting on your, investment justification or your grant application, and we look at your vulnerability assessment, and it is recommending you to purchase cameras and bollards, well, that's not consistent, right? If your vulnerability assessment is identifying bollards and lighting, then we look for you to list something consistent as that on your application. So I just wanted to reiterate, the importance of what you ask for in terms of your grant funding, your grant line items, being consistent with what is listed on your vulnerability assessment. That's all I have to say. But,
yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, questions? Yeah, and then actually, I was going to go ahead and do this next, but before questions, why don't we, if we could go ahead and have Gina go ahead and discuss it from her regional perspective and the things that she's done going out and seen these vulnerable systems done in practice. Okay, so Gina, do you want to go ahead and do that before we get into more general questions?
Sure. Excuse me. Sure. Thank you, Tom and Scott, for all that valuable information, and thank you, Cindy, for inviting me. As Tom mentioned early on, I'm from the NCRIC, the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. We sit in San Francisco, but we cover 15 counties in California, as far up as Del Norte, or Del Norte, maybe I'm saying that wrong, all the way down to Monterey County, and a little bit east. I want to reiterate, with all the information that's been given today, I think the moral to the story is, if you are interested in potentially applying for any, even if it's not this particular grant, any grant that involves a necessary vulnerability assessment, don't wait for those application deadlines to be revealed, because as Tom and Scott said, there's only about 6 weeks, and sometimes even less, because sometimes they fall over a kind of like a holiday time period, and that can really restrict the availability of your partners in getting to you to help you with your assessments. My most common request and experience that we support everyone, but my specific experience is more with faith-based and school facilities, but that's not limited to. Right now, I'm speaking as the entire team here at the NCRIC. We've lost a lot of personnel, so as you can probably imagine, I can't say yes to every vulnerability request that comes our way, but what I can do is try to provide you with some tools to either self-assess with volunteers within your organization, or try to get you contacts to your local law enforcement personnel that may be able to help you, or your local DHS PSA, or even, as Tom said, in a pinch, they have team members that can come help I had a family member die, and Tom's team came and helped me down in our AOR provide support. So we are all at one team. In fact, all those compliments Len was paying me at the beginning of this, when you thank me, you're thanking Tom, you're thanking Scott, you're thanking all of these agencies, because I've learned from them. I've worked with Tom many, many years now, and I've learned a lot from him over the years. So, so yeah, don't wait. If you have the interest in physical, someone asked the question on it, is this grant funding for social grant funding? No, this is specific to hardening your facility without making it look like Fort Knox or a prison, basically, is what I like to tell people. There are ways to harden the physical security of your building without making it look like, without the barbed wire, without the look of a darkened prison. I'm looking at my notes, are a little bit scattered, sorry. Vulnerability, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, vulnerability assessments do not expire. So let's say you're all hyped up from today's presentation. Tomorrow you schedule an assessment with someone, but you don't get around to applying for grant funding maybe next year or the year after. If you haven't mitigated the vulnerabilities, those vulnerabilities still exist. If you have mitigated some of the vulnerabilities, just provide an update. Sometimes when you mitigate one vulnerability, you create a new one. For example, getting new fences that may be taller might block some of the lighting and the cameras you had before. So it's kind of like a never-ending cycle. The vulnerability assessment, as Tom mentioned also, is just one small part of the application process. So when that deadline gets announced, we often find that people are scrambling to get their assessments and then realize after the assessment report's been provided to them that, oh man, this is just, there's so much more to do. This was just one small part of it. So yeah, don't wait, start now. I'm gonna keep saying that over and over. And as Len mentioned, he's applied 7 times and gotten awarded it 3 times. He used language like they weren't successful 4 of the times and whatever. I don't take it as he wasn't successful. I take it that someone else is in a higher need, and that was the funding that was available was maybe granted to them instead. Don't get discouraged if you don't get it. You know, there's the different allowances that are and amount of people that can compete for it each time. So don't get discouraged, just keep trying. One of the things that came up, someone was mentioning outdoor spaces, exposure to elements and whatnot. You know, during the pandemic, especially, spaces at facilities were created to support outdoor, maybe if it's a school, outdoor learning, if it's a church, outdoor, you know, capabilities to hear the mass or whatever services they're attending, outdoor group programs for maybe programs like AA or whatnot, that turned into permanent locations at their facility even after the pandemic. Everyone likes to be outside, at least I do. So I think there's a little bit more outdoor kind of permanent structures that are built that will also need to have a vulnerability assessment check. So if you've already gotten an assessment and you've added on through the pandemic to your facility, whether they were supposed to be temporary, get an update, make sure that's updated in your report. Len also mentioned having, when you have the law enforcement agency come in or the NICRT come in or DHS, yes, it's new eyes, but I also want to emphasize, ask folks at your facility who you may not have really considered asking. So if you're a church and you have a preschool, ask some of your preschool teachers what it looks like for them when they're locking up at night and leaving for the day. If you are an agency that supports you know, LGBTQ plus organizations or faith-based organizations, or any kind of organization that has experienced known hate, jump on this. Whether you are going to apply or not, it's worth just knowing what your vulnerabilities are. So some of the mitigation efforts can even be free in some cases. You just have to know what they are. I hope I'm making sense to everyone. I'm trying to go fast because I saw the clock just change to 4:30 just now. This specific grant funding, you know, when I go in and I do an assessment, I am thinking of worst case scenario, but in some cases, this could be violent crimes, hate crimes, or even accidental or unintentional. We had a facility who was positioned on a very busy intersection, and like their facility wall was hit 3 times by a speeding vehicle. It's just as simple as adding bollards or planters that are loaded with concrete in front of your building so that you're not hit if there's a classroom there, that the kids aren't in, you know, there's a mitigation effort. Not everything is, you know, violent intention, but in my 22 plus years of experience, of course, I'm going to be a little bit jaded and have that in mind constantly. It haunts my dreams, actually. So I'm going to end now and just emphasize working with your local law enforcement. Tom mentioned, even if you don't have a vulnerability assessment done, building that relationship with your local law enforcement, participate in their, you know, tip a cop type stuff and invite them to your stuff. You know, an example that was made public, you know, when shootings happen at various locations, in some cases, the police officers that responded already knew the layout of the facility because they were already working with that agency to understand where the locked doors are, to understand who's allowed in that facility, where the doors are, where the parking lot is, where hiding places might be. Have that connection with your local law enforcement partner. Depending on this, especially depending on the size of your facility. Not everyone is going to have these great big glorious you know, multi-story buildings, but it doesn't hurt to know who your local law enforcement connections are. Working with your law enforcement partners and with us, report suspicious activity. Tom has the slide up right now. It's at the top. Everything, for more information about what the NCRIC is, why it was built, is all on the website, ncric.ca.gov, ncric.ca.gov. There you can find how to report suspicious activity. There you can find how to report hate crimes. You can find information on private sector training capabilities. I invited our Director of Private Sector Engagement onto this call. Her name's Kim Pratt, and she is just chiming in on the chat. Kim, you're welcome to say hello as well. You can become a private sector partner with your connection with your agency, that your nonprofit agency. And she would be who would vet you and get you on board. And with that, you will get products that the NCRIC puts out that might have a threat nexus to what you're doing. Kim, do you want to cover anything more?
Hi, everyone. Just a real quick introduce myself. It's nice to see you all on this call and see some of your faces. I did put in the chat how to find more information about our private sector program, how to apply for membership. But as Gina said, we really encourage you. That's a great place to get information. We send out weekly partner update briefs and alerts if necessary, but there are all sorts of services from cyber to Gina and everything they're doing with the infrastructure and, you know, physical protection side of it. So nice to see you all. Thank you, Gina.
Thanks, Kim. I know I went through a lot of that stuff very quickly. As the Your Fusion Center, we are here to support you however we can. It might not be with a full physical vulnerability assessment, but we will do what we can to get you in line with someone who can help you if we can't for whatever reason. Again, I want to thank Cindy for inviting us. This is a passion of ours as a critical infrastructure protection team. I wish our only job was to do this kind of stuff for our partners, but it's only one of many things that we're tasked with here at the NCRIC. So
one of the things, Gina, that you said that kind of hit me is you can put them in touch with their local law enforcement agency that might, I know many of the law enforcement agencies have someone specific within their agency that does this kind of thing. And you have that kind of contact information for them. So I think that's a very critical part that we need to share with everyone is if you don't know who to go to the NCRIC and talk to Gina or someone from that team, and they can help you get in touch with your local law enforcement.
Yeah, we have what's called TLOs that sit here in the NCRIC, and then most law enforcement agencies have their own TLOs. TLO is a terrorism liaison officer, and they are trained and equipped to at least connect with you. I mentioned we're short-staffed. I'm sure you guys are short-staffed, and as well as our law enforcement agencies. It's an interesting time we're all living in with recovering from the pandemic.
All the more reason for people to get started early.
Yeah, we have members of law enforcement community agencies assigned here at the NCRIC, and they cover various locations within the 15 counties we cover. So if I put you in contact with someone, you might be surprised that it's not, for example, if you live in the city of Campbell, you might be surprised that I don't actually put you in touch with someone from Campbell PD, but maybe someone from Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office. And, you know, it's kind of a who you know situation sometimes when especially when people are leaving agencies and staffing is short. But we will do our best to get you, and if not your local, then a state or federal partner.
Great, thank you.
But start with volunteers. I mean, depending on what your organization does, you might have volunteers or members of your community that are police officers, and they don't have to be the police officer of your city. They you know, I don't know who's on this call and what organizations are here, but you know, check in with your communities and see military, security personnel, anyone who kind of goes to bed at night and lives this on a daily basis would be anyone that could help you do these assessments.
Great. That's great information. Thank you so much, Gina. And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining us and for participating in our workshop today. If you're not a member of Cadre's network, you can scan this QR code, and that will take you to cadresv.org, where you can sign up to be a member for free. So free is the last thing I'm going to say to you, other than thank you. Thank you for your participation.